Picture this. You walk into a medieval marketplace, and the fruit vendor hands you something that looks like nature had a fever dream. It's purple, it's hairy, it tastes like heaven mixed with a hint of, what the hell just happened to my mouth? You've just experienced what our ancestors took for granted. Fruits so incredible, so perfectly adapted to human taste buds, that losing them feels like accidentally deleting the only copy of your favorite song. Except instead of 3 minutes of music, we deleted centuries of agricultural genius. Today, we're obsessing over superfruits from distant lands while completely ignoring the fact that our medieval ancestors were already living in fruit paradise. They had access to flavors so complex, so perfectly balanced, that modern fruit breeders are desperately trying to recreate what we carelessly threw away. So buckle up, because we're about to tour 10 forgotten medieval fruits that were so good, their disappearance should be considered a crime against humanity. These aren't your boring, historically significant crops. These are the fruits that would make a modern foodie weep with joy, if they could actually find them. The medlar. You know how wine gets better with age? Well, meet the medlar, the fruit that invented the concept before grapes even thought about fermentation. Picture an apple that went to therapy and came back as a completely different fruit. The medlar looks like a small brown apple wearing a crown, and here's where it gets interesting. You can't eat it fresh. Trying to bite into a fresh medlar is like trying to eat a tennis ball soaked in battery acid. But here's the medieval magic trick. You let this thing rot. Not just a little soft, but properly, intentionally rotten. Medieval people would harvest medlars in late autumn, then store them in straw until they reached what they called bledded, basically the fruit equivalent of a fine cheese reaching perfect ripeness. When a medlar is properly bledded, it transforms into something that tastes like applesauce mixed with wine and cinnamon, with a texture smoother than pudding. Medieval nobles considered it such a delicacy that they'd serve it at banquets as a sign of sophistication. The medlar was so popular in medieval England that it appears in Shakespeare's plays as a symbol of patience and delayed gratification. Chaucer wrote about it. It was literally the fruit of intellectuals and poets. So why did we abandon this genius fruit? Because apparently, waiting for your fruit to ripen properly was too much work for the instant gratification crowd. We traded complexity for convenience, and now the medlar exists mainly in Old English gardens, like a wise elder that nobody visits anymore. The mulberry. Before we had industrial sugar production, before we discovered how to make everything taste like artificial strawberry, there was the mulberry, nature's candy dispensary. You've probably seen mulberry trees without even knowing it. They look ordinary, almost boring, until summer hits and they start dropping what can only be described as edible jewels all over the ground. Medieval people knew these trees were basically printing money, sweet, delicious, antioxidant-packed money. Here's what makes mulberries special. They taste like someone took a blackberry and a raspberry, gave them both PhDs in flavor chemistry, then asked them to collaborate on their masterpiece. The result is a fruit so intensely sweet and complex that medieval physicians prescribed them as medicine. White mulberries taste like honey mixed with vanilla. Black mulberries are like concentrated summer in berry form. Red mulberries hit that perfect sweet-tart balance that modern fruit breeders spend decades trying to achieve. But here's the kicker. Mulberries don't travel well. They're incredibly delicate, turning to mush within hours of picking. This meant they were a purely local treat, something you could only enjoy if you lived near the trees or knew someone who did. Medieval communities would plan their entire summer schedules around mulberry season. Children would stain their clothes purple, parents would make wine, and everyone would eat so many fresh mulberries that they'd literally get sick from too much of a good thing. The mulberry disappeared from our diets because modern agriculture prioritizes fruits that can survive being shipped across continents. We chose durability over deliciousness, and now most people have never tasted what our ancestors considered essential summer nutrition, the quince. If apples are the reliable friend of the fruit world, quinces are the mysterious, sophisticated cousin who studied abroad and came back speaking 3 languages. The quince looks like an apple that's been hitting the gym, larger, more angular, with a golden skin that feels like velvet when ripe. But here's where quinces get interesting. They're completely inedible raw. Take a bite of a fresh quince, and you'll understand why medieval people weren't stupid. They knew this fruit needed transformation. Medieval cooks turned quinces into what can only be described as edible magic. Quince paste was the medieval equivalent of gourmet chocolate, a luxury item that wealthy households would serve to impress guests. The process was elaborate. Cook the quinces slowly until they turned deep red, add honey or precious sugar, then shape the paste into elegant forms. The result? A flavor so complex and sophisticated that it makes modern fruit leather taste like cardboard. Imagine rose petals mixed with honey, with hints of apple and pear, and a subtle spice that you can't quite identify but absolutely crave. Quinces were so valuable in medieval times that they appeared in royal cookbooks and were given as diplomatic gifts. The Spanish word for jam, mermelada, literally comes from marmelo, the Portuguese word for quince. This fruit basically invented the entire concept of fruit preserves, but quinces require patience and skill. You can't just grab one and eat it like a modern apple. Medieval cooks understood that the best things in life require effort, transformation, and time. We lost quinces because we lost the willingness to work for extraordinary flavors. The damson plum. Meet the damson, a plum so small you could lose it in your pocket, yet so flavorful it could power a medieval feast for 30 people. Damsons look like regular plums that got shrunk in the wash, but don't let their size fool you. These little purple powerhouses pack more flavor per square inch than any fruit has a right to. They're intensely tart when fresh, with a astringency that makes your mouth pucker. But here's where medieval cooks showed their genius. Transform a damson through cooking, and you get something that tastes like concentrated plum essence mixed with wine and dark chocolate. Medieval households would turn damsons into preserves so intense that a single spoonful could flavor an entire pot of porridge. The damson was the medieval equivalent of a flavor bomb. Too intense to eat fresh, but absolutely essential for creating complex layered tastes in everything from meat dishes to desserts. Medieval recipes called for damson juice to balance rich meats, damson preserves to sweeten bitter herbs, and damson wine for celebrations. Here's what makes damsons special: they're incredibly hardy. While other fruit trees require perfect conditions, damsons thrive in marginal soil and harsh weather. They were the reliable friend of medieval agriculture, not the prettiest, not the easiest, but absolutely dependable. Damsons disappeared because modern consumers want fruit they can eat immediately. We lost patience for fruit that requires cooking, processing, or any kind of culinary skill. The damson became a victim of our demand for instant gratification. The green gage. If plums had a royal family, the green gage would be wearing the crown. This is the fruit that made French nobility fight wars over orchard rights. Green gages look like plums that went to finishing school, perfectly round, with skin so smooth it seems almost artificial. But the color is what sets them apart. A pale green that shifts to golden yellow when perfectly ripe, like jade that's been kissed by sunlight. The flavor? Imagine someone took honey, mixed it with the essence of summer flowers, then concentrated it into the most perfect sweet-tart balance ever achieved by nature. Green gages are so intensely flavorful that medieval people would eat them fresh, preserve them, turn them into wine, and use them in elaborate desserts. Here's the thing about green gages. They're incredibly finicky. They require perfect growing conditions, careful handling, and precise timing. Pick them too early, and they're sour. Pick them too late, and they turn to mush. There's maybe a 3-day window when a green gage reaches absolute perfection. Medieval orchardists understood this. They treated green gages like precious gems, carefully monitoring each tree, timing the harvest to the day, sometimes the hour. The result was a fruit so perfect that it justified the effort. But perfect green gages don't fit modern agriculture. They can't be mass-produced, shipped long distances, or stored for extended periods. They require the kind of attention and care that industrial farming considers inefficient. We abandoned green gauges because we chose quantity over quality, efficiency over excellence. Now this aristocrat of stone fruits survives mainly in specialty orchards, like a deposed royal living in exile. The elderberry. Before we had pharmacies on every corner, medieval people had elderberry bushes, nature's combination medicine cabinet and gourmet pantry. Elderberries look like tiny, dark purple pearls clustered together like nature's version of caviar. But these aren't just pretty berries. They're concentrated health in fruit form, with a flavor so complex it makes modern superfruits look like amateurs. Raw elderberries are terrible. Seriously, don't try this at home. They're mildly toxic and taste like someone mixed medicine with disappointment. But medieval cooks knew the secret. Cook elderberries and they transform into something magical. Properly prepared elderberries taste like concentrated grape juice mixed with wine, with hints of blackberry and a subtle earthiness that grounds the sweetness. Medieval households would turn them into syrups, wines, jellies, and cordials that served as both medicine and luxury drinks. Here's where elderberries get interesting. They're loaded with vitamin C, antioxidants, and immune-boosting compounds that medieval people understood intuitively. They used elderberry preparations to fight colds, boost energy, and maintain health through long, harsh winters. Elderberry wine was so popular in medieval Europe that some regions built their entire economies around it. Elderberry cordial was considered both a medicine and a delicacy, served to honored guests and used to treat illness. But elderberries require knowledge and skill to prepare safely. Modern consumers want fruit they can eat without thinking, without processing, without any risk or effort. We traded medicinal complexity for convenient simplicity and lost one of nature's most powerful health foods in the process. The serviceberry. While Europeans were perfecting their orchard fruits, North America had been quietly developing what might be the most perfect wild fruit ever created, the serviceberry. Serviceberries look like small blueberries, but they grow on trees instead of bushes, and they pack a flavor complexity that makes blueberries seem one-dimensional. When perfectly ripe, serviceberries taste like someone mixed blueberries with almonds, added a hint of cherry, then balanced everything with a subtle sweetness that never becomes cloying. Indigenous peoples had been cultivating and managing serviceberry populations for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. They understood that serviceberries were more than just fruit. They were a complete food system, providing fresh fruit in summer, dried fruit for winter storage, and ingredients for pemmican that could sustain travelers for months. Medieval European settlers encountered serviceberries and initially embraced them. Early colonial cookbooks include recipes for serviceberry pies, preserves, and wine. The fruit was so valuable that some colonial communities built their settlement locations around existing serviceberry groves. But here's where things went wrong. Serviceberries don't conform to European agricultural expectations. They're not as large as apples, not as sweet as grapes, and they don't store as well as dried fruits that Europeans were familiar with. Instead of adapting their expectations to this perfect wild fruit, Europeans tried to replace it with familiar orchard crops. The serviceberry represents one of history's greatest agricultural missed opportunities. We had access to a fruit that was perfectly adapted to North American climates, incredibly nutritious and absolutely delicious. And we abandoned it because it didn't match our preconceptions about what fruit should be. The Cornelian cherry. Don't let the name fool you. Cornelian cherries aren't cherries at all. They're something much more interesting. The ancient world's answer to the modern superfruit craze. Cornelian cherries look like elongated red olives, but they taste like someone took cranberries, made them less tart, added hints of cherry and plum, then concentrated everything into a bite-sized package of intense flavor. Ancient Greeks and Romans were obsessed with Cornelian cherries. They used them fresh, dried them for winter storage, turned them into wine, and incorporated them into elaborate dishes that combined sweet and savory flavors in ways that wouldn't be out of place in modern haute cuisine. Here's what made Cornelian cherries special. They're incredibly nutritious, packed with vitamin C, antioxidants, and compounds that ancient physicians recognized as medicinal. But unlike many medicinal foods, cornelian cherries actually taste good, tart and complex, with a astringency that makes them incredibly food-friendly. Medieval European monasteries cultivated cornelian cherries both as food and medicine. They appeared in medieval cookbooks as ingredients in everything from meat sauces to desserts. The trees were hardy, productive, and required minimal care, basically the perfect medieval crop. But cornelian cherries fell victim to agricultural standardization. They don't fit neat categories. They're not quite sweet enough to be dessert fruit, not quite tart enough to be purely culinary, and their unusual flavor doesn't match modern expectations about what fruit should taste like. We lost cornelian cherries because we lost tolerance for complexity. Modern agriculture prefers fruits that can be easily categorized and mass-marketed. The subtle, sophisticated flavor of cornelian cherries doesn't translate well to industrial food production. The rowan berry. If fruits had survival skills, rowan berries would be the Navy SEALs of the medieval orchard. These small, orange-red berries thrive in conditions that would kill most other fruits, and they pack a flavor so intense it borders on aggressive. Rowan berries grow on mountain ash trees that can survive at altitudes and in climates where other fruit trees give up and die. Medieval highland communities relied on rowan berries as one of the few reliable sources of fresh vitamin C in harsh mountainous regions where traditional orchard fruits couldn't survive. Raw rowan berries are nearly inedible, intensely bitter with an astringency that makes your entire mouth pucker. But medieval cooks knew the secret. Freeze them, cook them, or ferment them, and they transform into something extraordinary. Properly prepared rowan berries taste like cranberries mixed with orange peel, with a complex bitterness that balances perfectly with honey or other sweeteners. Medieval recipes used rowan berries to create jellies so intensely flavored that a small amount could transform an entire dish. Rowan berry wine was legendary in medieval Scotland and Scandinavia, a drink so potent and complex that it was reserved for special occasions and honored guests. The berry's natural astringency created wines with incredible depth and aging potential. But rowan berries require processing skill and cultural knowledge that has been largely lost. Modern consumers expect fruit that tastes good immediately, without processing, without any learning curve. We abandoned rowan berries because they demand respect, patience, and culinary skill. The rowan berry represents our loss of connection to foods that require effort and understanding. We traded complexity and resilience for convenience and immediate gratification. The bullace. Meet the bullace, the fruit that looked at thousands of years of agricultural domestication and said, "Thanks, but I'm good being wild." Bullaces are small, round plums that grow wild throughout Europe, and they represent everything that's fascinating about undomesticated fruit. They're variable. Some trees produce sweet fruit, others tart, others nearly inedible. They're unpredictable. A tree might produce abundantly one year and nothing the next. They're challenging. The fruit requires careful timing and often processing to reach its potential. And they're absolutely delicious. A perfect bullace tastes like concentrated plum essence with hints of wine and spice. Medieval people would search for the best wild bullace trees and guard them like family secrets. They'd make pilgrimages to specific groves when the fruit was ripe, and they'd process bullaces into preserves, wines, and cordials that captured the wild complexity that domesticated fruit had lost. Here's what makes bullaces special. They retain the genetic diversity and intense flavors that thousands of years of selective breeding have bred out of domestic plums. Each tree is essentially unique, producing fruit with its own distinct character. Medieval communities understood that bullaces represented a different relationship with food, one based on discovery, seasonal timing, and acceptance of natural variation. Finding a great bullace tree was like discovering a natural treasure. But bullaces don't fit modern agricultural systems. They can't be standardized, mass-produced, or guaranteed to produce consistent results. They represent everything that industrial agriculture has tried to eliminate: unpredictability, variation, and the need for local knowledge. We lost bullaces because we lost tolerance for wildness in our food system. We chose predictability over discovery, standardization over adventure. The bitter truth about what we've lost. Here's the thing that hurts the most about these forgotten fruits. We didn't lose them to disease, climate change, or natural disaster. We lost them to convenience culture. Every single one of these fruits was abandoned because they didn't fit the modern food system's demands for standardization, long shelf life, and immediate gratification. We traded complexity for simplicity, local adaptation for global shipping, and culinary skill for grab-and-go convenience. Medieval people understood something we've forgotten. The best foods often require effort, knowledge, and patience. They were willing to wait for meddlers to blet, learn to process elderberries safely, and search for the perfect bullis tree because they understood that extraordinary flavors justify extraordinary effort. But here's the hopeful part. These fruits aren't extinct. They're forgotten, not gone. Small-scale growers, heritage orchardists, and dedicated gardeners are quietly maintaining populations of all these incredible fruits. Specialty nurseries sell the trees. Seed savers maintain genetic diversity. Food historians document traditional preparation methods. The lost medieval fruit paradise isn't actually lost. It's just waiting for us to remember that convenience isn't everything. Imagine walking into a farmer's market and finding fresh mulberries that stain your fingers purple. Picture learning to blet meddlers until they reach perfect ripeness. Think about discovering the tree that produces the perfect service berries, or learning to transform bitter rowan berries into complex wine-like jellies. These fruits represent more than just flavors we've lost. They represent a relationship with food based on seasonality, locality, and skill. They remind us that the most extraordinary experiences often require patience, effort, and willingness to learn. The medieval fruit paradise is still there, waiting in heritage orchards, wild groves, and the gardens of people who refuse to let complexity die. It's waiting for us to decide that extraordinary flavor is worth the effort, that seasonal eating creates anticipation and joy, and that the best things in life, including fruit, often require patience and skill. Maybe it's time to stop searching for the next superfruit from distant lands and start rediscovering the incredible flavors that our ancestors knew by heart. Maybe it's time to plant a medlar tree, learn to process elderberries, or search for the perfect bullis grove. Maybe it's time to remember that the best fruits aren't always the most convenient ones. They're the ones that taste like they were worth the wait. After all, medieval people weren't stupid. They knew good fruit when they tasted it. And they knew that some things, like perfect flavor, never go out of style. They just go out of practice.